Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
So welcome everyone to the group chat brought to you by Overmark. I'm your host Darrell, and with me today is Brian, Overmark's history and SS tutor. So many of you have pointed out on our Instagram stories asking us to, hey, please get somebody on the show to talk about humanities. And so we are here today to bring you the content that you want. Okay, if you're watching this on YouTube, do give us a like because that will really help out with the algorithm to help more people discover our video. But without further ado, maybe I'll let Brian introduce himself.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian. I've been tutoring for about 3 years now, and I started as a peer tutor for JC in history. So I've always felt an affinity and interest towards history, and actually I didn't do so well for the subject in lower secondary. But I began to slowly do better as I slowly understood how to approach questions and content and became better. So I'm currently studying law and liberal arts at UNUS and NUS, and I'm excited to share with everyone the secrets of how to do well for history and social studies.
Well, I mean, today's topic, I think a lot of students out there, they're really looking forward to this. I think the cool thing about Brian is that he doesn't only do history and SS. In fact, when I first met him, his specialization was more in H2 history. So to all the A-level students out there that are listening, I think Brian has a lot of interesting and meaningful insights that we would want to dive into. But I think just to start off the podcast, Brian, could you just run us through an overview of how history or social studies is like as a subject in terms of the different components, the SBQ as well as the essays?
Okay, so for history and social studies, right, how the paper is split into two papers, right? So you have your history paper and your social studies paper. 60% of the history and social studies marks come from the source-based questions, which are the parts that most students struggle with. So actually, contrary to popular belief, right, history and SS don't require a lot of memorization and marking. They actually require a lot of critical thinking because the bulk of the marks are within the SBQ. And I think for history and SS, right, the most important thing to understand is that it is sprint, but a marathon. So for these subjects, right, studying last minute will not really help you that much. It is much better to pace out the work you need to do so that you can fully internalize all of it. And I know many students might think that history and SS are like fundamentally different topics. Because on one hand, you're talking about the past, and on the other hand, you're talking about the present. But actually, they are fundamentally the same thing at the O levels. The skills needed for SBCS and SCQ for history and SS are both the same. You just need to be a critical thinker.
Just a bit of context for myself. Actually, I used to teach history and SS, but that was quite a while ago. Over the years, I started to specialize more into chemistry and physics. But a cool fact is that I actually written, the answer sheets you buy for TYS. I was actually working with one of the publishers, and I was the one that was actually writing the answer sheets itself. So I got a bit of insight in terms of how, those answers were being curated. And back to the point on Brian said, I think something that's very underrated is that social studies as well as history, both, there are two main components in source-based as well as in essay. A lot of students think that there's a lot of content and they dread the subject. But the truth is, if you manage to nail your SBQs, your source-based skills well, actually you really have a very good foundation to do well. In fact, the source-based, the component, the percentage is a lot bigger. And that's something that you need more practice on rather than purely about the content part of things. So moving on from just the overview, let's talk about what are some of the common things students tend to struggle in. So Brian, based on your years of teaching, what are the areas that students struggle with the most for humanities?
Actually, a lot of students think that they struggle with content because they're always thinking that, oh, it's too much content to memorize, all that, etc. But I think the things that most students struggle with is not content, because everyone can memorize, everyone can remember content. But what they struggle with is having the skills to interpret questions and write effectively. So actually writing effectively is a skill that everyone has. Some have it more, some less, but it's like a muscle, right? It can be true. I mean, everyone has heard of PEEL, but how many people can do it effectively? So I think that's what is most important for students who are struggling with history and SS, which is to write effectively. And the most critical aspect that most students actually struggle with is the source-based case study. I mean, we've already said that the source-based case study makes up 60% of the grade, right? And this is where the good students stand out from the rest. Because everyone can memorize essays, they can spot topics, and they can score A2 or A1 for the structured essay questions. But actually, what people don't know is that the source-based case study is the most rewarding because it rewards critical thinking and not just mugging. In fact, you don't have to study as much for the source-based case study, and you can score even more marks than the structured essay questions. So specifically for the source-based case study, where many students struggle with is knowing how to answer in the first place. I mean, at first glance, it can be quite confusing when the questions are asking you, are the sources reliable? Are the sources useful? And then the thing that students face is that they don't know how to answer the question. Like, what do I need to write? What do I need to include? What do I need to explain? So actually, it's very systematic when you approach the question in the first place. So if you review the 10-year series, Cambridge always sets the same few types of questions despite the content changes. So with the same few question types and the same approach to approaching all the same question types, you can answer all of them in the same ways. You just have to copy the content, put it in, and there's a structured template for answering source-based case study questions. Learning how to answer these questions is the most important thing. Why? Because besides learning to answer the question, another thing that most students suffer from as a result of this is a lack of time management. So when you learn how to answer these questions, it's like providing a guideline for your mind to focus on the most important things to write, and it streamlines your focus, which is really important given the time constraint of the O-levels.
Yeah, I think those are really common areas that I think a lot of students can relate to. And I just want to go back to the point on the memorization of content versus source-based skills. I think there's a common dilemma for students when we are talking about history and SS. How much content to memorize, so on and so forth. The truth is the content is there. Meanwhile, what you should be focusing on along the years as you're doing the practices is not so much just a regurgitation of vomiting out all your content over and over again, but you are supposed to be more familiar with the structure on how to answer your source base. So source base is a skill that you need to develop. So whenever you practice, don't just go in with the idea of, I just want to complete my homework, or I just want to complete this paper. Think about the kind of questions that come out and look at the structure and how you're able to answer those questions effectively. So like what Brian said, like all source-based questions, there is a certain format, and you just have to find the pattern and the structure that would work. For example, if we're talking about reliability, it's definitely about the cross-referencing, right? So you just need to know, okay, after you do your PEL, you need to cross-reference, then you need to provide a link. So there's a very systematic way of doing it. And the more practices you get with that structure in mind, the better you will be able to score the next time around a question comes out. Okay, Brian, I know this is not within what we planned for, but are you able to address a bit on one very difficult part, which I think a lot of students will struggle with, which is hybrid questions for SBQ? So do you have any insights on that, and maybe just shed some, golden nuggets that our students should know about when they're approaching hybrid questions?
To raise the example of comparing between reliability, right? It's actually very simple. All you have to do is remember the structure to answering a reliability question. You copy for source A, then you copy for source B. So you answer within the structure for source A and source B, and then you just write an additional sentence or two at the end, which states that I think that source B or source A is more reliable, and then you just explain. So actually, there's not much change up in the structure. You just have to adapt your thinking to think of how best you will answer the question. So actually, all these, it's quite spontaneous and on the spot. But at the end of the day, the fundamental structure doesn't change if you are talking about hybrid question where the base, the fundamental question demand is asking you to measure the reliability of a source. Yeah. So at the end of the day, hybrid questions, when you look at it, just make sure that you are able to sieve out what is important. What is the question asking me for? Is it asking me to compare the source first? Or is it asking me to evaluate the reliability of the source first?
Once you get used to the different question types, you'll jump straight into it. And something that a lot of students miss out and they can literally get 0 marks for is that when they fail to answer the question. So answering the question comes first. The question, it might vary because there's no way we can confidently predict how Cambridge will set the questions. But something that you can have control over is how you make sure you directly answer the question and showcase the skills that are required in the source-based questions. Okay, now moving on from what students tend to struggle, Brian, can you share with us how can students do well for history and SS?
Actually, I think this is not just specific to history and SS. I think this is in general for all humanities subjects, right? So the first thing I would do is I would skim through all the content once. So, I mean, maybe reading a textbook might not be the most efficient, but you could read the school notes or you could read the curated notes that we provide an overmark. So skim through all the content once. And for each chapter, just distill your thoughts and write down 3 essential questions that you think are absolutely critical to the chapter. And then when you're done with these 3 questions, write down your answers to the chapter. This is just for content memory. And when you're writing down the answers for the chapter, the important thing is don't skip on the details. So if you think that the details are important, don't skim on them. Because it's not just about writing it out, it's also about committing it to muscle memory. Because oftentimes we like to type now, right? But when you're sitting for the written exam, it's all handwritten. So you must be able to have the ability to have that muscle memory ingrained within your fingers. After that, when you're done with the content, read through the answering techniques guide that your school might give, or the ones in the curated notes, right? So you have your content, now you have the structure in your head. Then the third step is to use the guide and just keep doing practices. It doesn't matter the content of the SPCS, whether you are particularly familiar with what is within the SPCS, especially for social studies, where you can't really spot the source-based case studies, because it varies every single year from a topic that you might be familiar with to a topic that you're completely unfamiliar with. Just ensure that you can discern between the question types and know how to use the sources to approach them in your head. And then for the last point, right, if you are someone that really struggles with writing quickly, then I suggest you have to practice more time papers. If not, just thinking more quickly by optimizing your learning through mental revision will be more than sufficient for most students.
Well, I think those are some legit advice, and I hope everybody that's listening, you're taking that in. So the tips to do well for history and SS, I think is no secret. And to go back on one of the pointers for looking at content first, followed by knowing your structure, I think something that's very important is that you need to recognize that actually more for history, your source base will come from a certain team, right? So the very fact that if you're comfortable with the content and you already know roughly how the whole sources will play out, you actually have a much easier time looking at the sources. For example, you know that if you're talking about, let's say, Stalin, right, there will be like pro-communist, and then there will be like more of the anti-communist sort of source-based questions. So from there, you have a very good idea on like when you're doing comparison of sources or evaluating all sources or the usefulness even, you have a very good idea on like how to use the sources to your advantage. And that comes from the content. I know content is not something that you might find it difficult because you might find it boring and stuff, but sometimes also exploring different ways of learning the same sort of content. If reading the textbook is not for you, reading notes not for you, there's actually a lot of resources online where you can find on YouTube even easily about content that you're supposed to learn about in a more interactive manner through animation. Or if you're more of a film person, you can start watching more films that are related, like Dunkirk. I'm pretty sure you can go out there and find, like, you probably know it better than I do, but you can ask your history teacher for reference as well. For social studies, in fact, a lot of these issues are very current social issues. So if you're talking about things like regarding governance, or you're talking about welfare state, I think there are plenty of documentaries out there that you can go and learn the content. So depending on your preference, cater your learning towards how you want it to be and what's interesting for you. Some students find it very effective to do their own notes or to use cue cards, So these are all things that you just need to go and explore. Don't be so fixated on like, I just need to memorize, because there's a limit to how much you can download that content. So find ways that's a bit more interesting for yourself to learn that content and to make the whole subject a lot more enjoyable. I mean, Brian, you mentioned a point about time management and stuff like that, and we all know how difficult it was. Just to share a bit of my personal experience, literally for my history SS paper, right, when they say you may start now, right, I didn't even put down my pen once and I still couldn't finish the paper. And I'm not exaggerating because there's just so much to write. So maybe we can move on more towards the exam side of things, in terms of exam strategies, how do students optimize the scoring as well as manage their time.
Okay, I think first thing first that students need to know is that done is better than perfect. So actually right now, if you are a student listening, I want you to take one perfect answer sheet that your teacher has given you and completely ignore it. right? So you don't have to answer that way for your examination, because the fact is that you won't be able to write that much within the time constraint. Time management is actually the biggest issue for most students, but it is important to note that you will score more marks if you are able to answer all the questions satisfactorily than only some of the questions perfectly. Because if you look at the grading criteria, the difference between an L3 and an L4 paper, L4 mark paper is actually not that big. It's at most 2 to 3 marks, right? So to score L3, you might need a two-sided answer that has a balanced conclusion. That might net you 6 out of 8 marks versus an L4 answer that will net you 7 or 8 out of 8 marks. It makes more sense to finish 6 out of 8 marks questions and score 18 out of 24 versus you finish 2 questions and you leave the last one blank, but you only score 14 out of 24, right? So while there are ideal answers, sometimes good enough is just enough already. So when you think you're about done, you think you have hit the minimum criterion for that satisfies yourself, which is L3, move on to the next question. No matter how good an answer is, you don't get any bonus marks for writing a perfect answer. In fact, you get penalized because you have lesser time to write your answers for the subsequent questions. So if you are really someone who goes with time, focus on hitting the criteria of at least 3 for each question. Don't bother to try and score an L4 as it might require too much time. Finish the paper and score as much marks as you can, right? The next thing for time management, right, is don't rush into doing your source-based case studies. So for structured essay questions, I find that most of my students, they're able to finish in time. Or the reason why they can't finish in time is because they're not writing fast enough. And that's just something you have to practice. But for source-based case studies, many students fail to finish on time. Why? It's because they don't interrogate the sources first. So they always think, right, like, I don't have enough time, I want to jump straight into answering the question. That's actually wrong. What you should be doing is that you should be looking through all the sources before you even read the question. And as you are looking through the sources, you can sort of have an insight into what the source is saying, or have an insight into the context of the source. So when you plan, you are able to save the amount of time needed for you to write later on. So it reduces the amount of time you need to think through the questions later on. The important thing to note here is that smooth is fast. So for time management, these are the 2 tips that are most important. First is to get everything done rather than answer a question perfectly. The second is to plan things out and don't rush into doing your source-based case study. It's better for you to plan out the questions first and then to spend a little bit more time to plan out questions first so that your journey later is much smoother.
It is like flashbacks to back in the day when I was doing my own paper. Really, the time is really never enough. And it's been a while since I took my O-levels, like almost 10 years ago, but I do remember myself using a similar strategy whereby I try to hit the minimum sum for each question. So I think I might not have done purpose for certain questions because I know it takes up way too much time. And then for my essays, I also didn't write the conclusion because it's only worth like 1 to 3 marks. I forgot what was the allocation, but I did it in such a manner. Then once I completed my paper, with the last 10 minutes, I tried to like absorb all these mini points. So I think of the whole exam and my time allocation as like my resources. Going into a game, this is the amount of set of rules I have to play with. So I allocate the time to maximize my output. And then with the remaining time, then I try to pick up the remaining scraps of points that I could get along the paper. I think that worked out really well, and that was a strategy I got A1 so that was great. But I'm just sharing that in itself is a real strategy. And if your teacher have not taught you this, I think this is something very important for you to pick up. Understanding that the enemy here is not yourself, but time. Having said that, I think looking at the sources is really important. A lot of times students just jump into the source without reading I don't know what is it called, is it provenance or like, the context of the background of the source, because that changes the game drastically. So if the source is coming from Germany talking about freaking Russia, Soviet Union, it's going to be something that's against already. So I think that in itself implies what you should be expecting from your source-based questions analysis. For the essay part, I think there's less surprises because the kind of questions and the sort of content that they could test is a bit more fixed. So I think there's lesser worry on that end. But when you enter the exam hall, you need to have a very clear-cut strategy and you need to be very disciplined with it. I know once, for example, if you memorize this essay, even the conclusion, and then it comes out, all right, you'll be very tempted to score the full marks, right? Because you already know all the content. It's like 3 marks. But you need to remember that most of the points that are waiting for you is in the source base. So forgo that 1 or 2 extra marks if needed so that you have sufficient time for the other parts of the paper. It requires a bit of discipline, and I think it requires a lot more of understanding how to win the game in the exam. Because in the exam, it's not about, at least for history and SS, it's not about whether you know the content, because most people do. But the struggle would be whether you're able to finish everything in time. And it's no exaggeration. So if you have your prelims upcoming, try to apply the strategy and the time allocation that you have, and so that when you do it at O level, it's not something that's fresh or new. And if you're doing practices like Brian mentioned, it's so important for it to be a time practice, because if you're just doing at your own pace, that defeats the purpose. You already have the structure, you already know how to do it. So the next step for you would be to do it within the time given. Okay, Brian, I think we spoke a lot about the important parts on where students struggle, how do they do well, and exam strategies as well. Now, here's the dilemma of the week. And I think a lot of students out there will be waiting for this, which is, should we be spotting the different teams? So if I remember correctly, I mean, at least across Combined Humans, I think there are 5 main teams. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then in the exam, it will come out at least 3. So is it right for students to like spot, maybe they only study 3, then they don't study 2, or should they only study like 2? What's your thoughts on this? I just wanted to hear what's your opinion, and then I'll share mine afterwards.
Okay, I think for history, right, it is possible to spot. So what is going to come out in the exam will be 2 topics, right? Sorry, it'll be a part A and part B for one topic, and it will be a part A and part B for another topic. So given that you have 4 to 5 chapters, right, you can actually spot, in a sense, not in a way where students think you spot 2 chapters out of 5, but more of like, you can afford to not study 1 out of 5 chapters. So actually, it is possible to spot for history. For social studies, it is a little bit more difficult because you have 3 major themes, right? And 2 questions are going to come out. So again, it is possible to not spot a single theme, but it will be difficult, and I'll explain why I don't recommend it later on. So indeed, you can spot, I just don't recommend it. The content actually for history and SS is very digestible. You just have to make sure you study smart. So in the first place, there's not much of a major reason to start spotting, because you tend to put yourself at a disadvantage. Why? What if the topic that you spot doesn't come out, right? Or worse still, it comes out, but it is harder than the question, which is the topic that you didn't study for. So because it's harder, right, you will do worse than others for the same section of marks. For your part B section of your history paper, you'll score 10 out of 15 marks versus other students who will score 12 or 13 out of 15 marks because they chose the easier question, which is a topic that you didn't study for. And I think it's important to note that for Cambridge O levels, everything is graded on a bell curve. So it means even if you're doing a tougher question and you're scoring 10 out of 15 versus the other student scores 12 out of 15, you'll be graded lower on the bell curve as compared to them. So actually, I think it's more important to give yourself a wide array of options so that eventually when you do the paper, you can pick the easiest question that allows you to score the most amount of marks in the least amount of time. So in conclusion, I would say that spotting is possible, but do not spot. But when I mean spotting, I mean that you can afford to not study 1 chapter. That's the limit. But beyond that, I do not recommend spotting at all.
I mean, to put things into perspective, most of you will only be taking your O levels or A levels only once, right? So the question is, will you want to take that gamble? I think it would be a lot easier for you mentally to think about, okay, I just need to study 1 or 2 really well and pray that it come out. But you need to acknowledge that your praying has no effect on what question is going to come out. And for me, I don't think it's a smart thing to do or a wise thing to do to be taking that gamble, especially when you only have 1 shot, right? So this is the only chance you'll be sitting for the paper. And if whatever you spotted doesn't come out, that's it for you. And some of you for Combined Humanities, if it's your only humanities, you don't take a pure, right? It means it's going to affect your L1, R5 or L1, R4. It has a huge impact on wherever you want to hit over next. So the question now is it worth it to spot? I'll say no as well. So I will agree with Brian completely that at most you can exclude 1 topic that you hate and you're like, absolutely, I cannot do Cold War. Screw this, I'm out of it. Maybe that would be good. But even so, I'll encourage you to still study Cold War. Why? It's because it might appear in your SBQ and you have zero knowledge on the sources and the different parties involved. You will have a hard time doing your source base too. So the truth is, if it's within your syllabus, you are required to know it. However, I do encourage you to do extra preparation on topics that you like. So in the case that it comes out, you know you can ace it. So it's rather than saying that I remove topics and I'll be lazy and I don't want to study them, I'm thinking about it from the perspective that I can invest in the topic that I like, I do more on it. I think that would be a better way of looking at things. And if you go and ask your teachers, I think most of them will have the same perspective. But let's say if it's a super last minute and you really don't have the resources and the time to do so, which you should be avoiding if you're listening to the podcast here now in July, you have the time to prepare for sure. But let's say in a die scenario where you totally neglected this subject, then should you spot? The answer is at the same time, I rather you have minimal knowledge for each team, but still not to zero down and bet on 1 and 2. Because no matter how you study the trend or you pray to the God, nothing is going to change. This is something that's out of our control. So don't gamble on your O levels. I don't think it's worth the risk. I think what you would want to do is to invest the time to go ahead and prepare yourself sufficiently. So exam is not a time for you to be taking that gamble. And I think both of us, we strongly discourage that. And we hope that message goes across to everyone. If you think that I'm a bit gibberish, it's because I just took my vaccination check. So I was a little bit out of it, but I'm still here to bring you the quality content that you asked for. But just to sum up this podcast, maybe throwing the time back to Brian. All in all, how would you want students to view history and SS as a subject? Like what should they be thinking about when they are studying and revising for this topic?
Well, actually, that's a really good question that I haven't had the chance to really think about. But I think the most important thing for me is to view history and SS not as a subject to study for, but as something to encourage yourself as a critical thinker, right? So, I mean, everyone enjoys watching movies, and history is deeply embedded in a lot of the movies that you see. So, compared to just looking at the history textbooks and the content as just things on paper that are dead, we are talking about dead old men here. But actually, these dead old men have lived very interesting lives. So, if you can change your perspective towards studying history, and you'll realize that it's actually very rewarding and it's very interesting, and you will have a fuller perspective on the past. Similarly, when you're looking at history questions, you might always think that, wow, actually, it's really difficult to answer. I'm doing a lot of work, doing a lot of writing, it's very difficult. But actually, it will help you provide yourself with a fuller understanding of the subject, right? So it's like, I think the best thing to think of it is to change the way you view it, such that it's like a puzzle, right? You're piecing together pieces of history to come up with a coherent argument. Or you are looking back in the past and you are thinking, would someone in the past think that a source from Hitler's youth party would be reliable? So I think that's a quite interesting way to view history. As for social studies, I think the difficult part where most students find social studies difficult is the fact that there is no concrete answers. It is exactly what makes social studies interesting, right? So I mean, all the issues that we're studying today are deeply rooted in current social issues. So if you think of yourself as someone who wants to know more about the world, know more about the society that we live in, then I think social studies is a very rewarding subject to think about and to study. So all in all, I think that is what I would say, or what I would encourage students to think and reframe their perspective towards history and social studies.
Well, I think that is really inspiring. Okay, I share a real life story with you. So I went on exchange in Europe, and I definitely traveled to all your key countries. Like I go to UK, I go to your Germany and stuff like that. But I think the thing that allowed me to enjoy those countries a lot more in terms of like their museums and their attractions is not just there to see scenery. But when I went there and I look at, for example, the memorial site for the Holocaust, I understood the significance of it. And I went to like Chamberlain's war chambers in UK. I understood what they were doing there and what they were trying to do to fight the Nazi. So it added so much more meaning to my travel because I understood the value of the storylines and the different plot points across history. And compared to my other friends that were traveling with me, they were just there, oh, very nice. They didn't really know how to appreciate it because the difference was that I knew about history. And if you're talking about movies, for example, I think the X-Men series, it was also about dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for somebody watching without context, might be just thinking, wow, why two ships trying to like threaten each other and move towards each other, right? But you understood like the significance of it underlying the Cold War and the possible nuclear outcomes of that crisis, and you're able to enjoy and really appreciate all these history references a lot more. I think that's something that just gives you a bit more perspective and to allow you to be more a global citizen. I think all the more so for social studies. I mean, sometimes I'm quite cynical for social studies because everything there almost says that the government is great, government is awesome. But let's put that aside and think about it critically. You as a Singaporean now, okay, and eventually when you grow up, do you want to be ignorant? No, ignorance is not bliss, you know. So learning about these social issues early on, not just from the frame of O levels or A levels, but understanding the greater implication on society, I think that's something very meaningful. You don't want to go across as, you know, you don't even know what's going on with your country and you don't really know what are some of the social issues. So look at history and social studies from a more from a lens of upgrading yourself beyond just looking at it as pure content. And I think the subject itself would be so much more enjoyable there to appreciate. So I think from that perspective, hopefully it'll make the subject a bit more digestible and it also makes it more appealing. And I think with that, we come to the end of the group chat. We hope that this podcast has been helpful in terms of helping you learn more about history and SS and how you can do well in it. If you're watching this on YouTube, please smash the like button because that will help more people discover our video. In the comment section, please let us know what topics you'd like us to discuss next, and we'll be more than happy to talk about it. And with that, we'll come to the end of the podcast, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
It sound right, boy.